March 8th, 1943, 2:47 a.m., North Atlantic, 680 miles west of Ireland. Korvettenkapitän Klaus Bargstein stood in the cramped control room of U-521, studying the convoy positions his radio operator had just decoded from BDU headquarters in Paris. The 23-boat Wolfpack was assembling perfectly. In 6 hours they would strike convoy HX-229, and the slaughter would begin. Bargstein allowed himself a rare smile. The British had no idea they were coming. What Bargstein didn't know, what none of the 23 U-boat commanders gathering like sharks in the darkness could have imagined, was that 200 miles away in a concrete bunker beneath Liverpool, a young British woman was watching a cathode ray tube that showed the precise location of every submarine in his Wolfpack. The device that betrayed them was something German naval intelligence had dismissed as technically impossible. They called it Huff-Duff, a playful abbreviation for high-frequency direction finding, and German submariners had laughed at British claims about its capabilities. Radio direction finding was old technology, imprecise, requiring multiple shore stations and complex triangulation. Everyone knew it couldn't work at sea, couldn't provide accurate bearings, couldn't possibly detect the brief transmissions U-boats made on high frequencies. The Germans were wrong about everything. By March 1943, Huff-Duff had evolved into the most lethal submarine hunting tool ever deployed, and it was systematically destroying the U-boat force. Within 5 months, the technology that German intelligence called propaganda would help sink more submarines than the entire Royal Navy had destroyed in the first 3 years of war. This is the story of how radio waves became weapons, how German arrogance met British ingenuity, and how a technology dismissed as impossible turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. The origins of Germany's fatal miscalculation began in the 1930s, when Kriegsmarine communication specialists convinced themselves that their radio procedures were unbreakable and undetectable. They had good reason for confidence. German naval communications operated on shortwave frequencies between 3 and 30 MHz, where radio waves behaved unpredictably. During daylight, these frequencies could communicate over thousands of miles by bouncing off the ionosphere. At night, the same frequencies might barely reach 100 miles. This unpredictability made direction finding nearly impossible using conventional methods. Traditional radio direction finding used large rotating loop antennas that measured signal strength in different directions. The antenna was manually turned until the signal reached minimum strength, indicating the antenna was perpendicular to the transmission source. This method worked adequately for long-wave transmissions from shore stations, but shortwave signals from ships at sea created multiple problems. The ionospheric bounce meant signals arrived from multiple angles simultaneously. The rotating antenna required minutes to determine a bearing, far longer than typical U-boat transmissions lasted. Accuracy degraded severely beyond 500 miles. Multiple shore stations were needed for triangulation, and their bearings were often contradictory. German naval planners studied these limitations and concluded that radio direction finding posed minimal threat to submarine operations. Their confidence was reinforced by reports from Spanish intelligence services during the Spanish Civil War, where German communications specialists tested British direction-finding capabilities. The British appeared to have nothing beyond conventional rotating loop systems. Kapitän José Karl Dönitz, architect of Germany's U-boat strategy, built his entire tactical system around this assumption. His Wolfpack tactics required submarines to radio detailed position reports, weather observations, and convoy sightings to headquarters in France. BDU, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, submarine command, would analyze these reports and radio back precise instructions coordinating group attacks. The system was radio-intensive by design. A single Wolfpack operation might generate 200 radio transmissions over 48 hours. Dönitz's communications staff assured him this was safe. U-boat transmissions were brief, typically under 30 seconds. They used high frequencies that the British couldn't accurately direction find. The boats transmitted while submerged using underwater antennas, making visual detection impossible. The Enigma encryption made the content unreadable. What Dönitz didn't know was that British scientists had already solved the technical problems German experts claimed were impossible. The breakthrough began not with the Royal Navy, but with a Scottish physicist named Robert Watson Watt, working at the Radio Research Station in Slough. In 1935, while developing early warning radar systems, Watson Watt's team stumbled onto a solution for high-frequency direction finding that bypassed all conventional limitations. Instead of using rotating mechanical antennas, they developed a fixed antenna array with multiple elements arranged in specific geometric patterns. By comparing the phase and amplitude of signals received simultaneously by different antenna elements, they could calculate bearing instantly without any mechanical movement. The system used cathode ray oscilloscopes to display bearing information visually, allowing operators to read direction from the screen the moment a transmission began. Most importantly, the system worked at sea. By 1938, the Admiralty had installed experimental sets on several destroyers and armed merchant cruisers. The initial results were promising but problematic. The equipment was temperamental, requiring constant calibration. The antenna arrays were large and visible, making warships easier to identify. The accuracy was good within 200 miles but degraded at longer ranges. Most critically, there weren't enough sets to matter, strategically. When war began in September 1939, Britain had fewer than 50 Huff-Duff sets in service, mostly shore-based. The technology existed, but deployment was minimal. During the first 18 months of war, U-boats ravaged Atlantic convoys with near impunity, and Dunitz's Wolfpack tactics evolved into a devastatingly effective system. By late 1940, German submarines were sinking ships faster than British and American shipyards could replace them. If the trend continued, Britain would be starved into surrender by mid-1942. The Royal Navy's anti-submarine warfare capabilities were primitive. ASDIC, the sonar system that was supposed to detect submerged submarines, worked poorly in rough seas and couldn't detect surfaced U-boats at all. German submarines spent most of their time on the surface, submerging only to attack or evade, making ASDIC nearly useless. Aircraft patrols were limited by range and weather. Convoys relied primarily on visual lookouts scanning empty ocean, hoping to spot periscopes or surface submarines before they attacked. The U-boats held every advantage. They chose when and where to attack, assembled in Wolfpacks that overwhelmed escorts, and communicated freely, coordinating attacks with headquarters. German submariners called it the happy time. British sailors had other names for it. The turning point began in February 1941 when the Admiralty made a critical decision. Instead of installing Huff-Duff sets only on warships, they would put them on convoy escort vessels and merchant ships. The Type FH-3 set, developed by the Admiralty Signal Establishment specifically for convoy use, was smaller and more robust than earlier models. More importantly, it was designed for operation by merchant marine radio officers, not specialized naval technicians. The first convoy equipped with Huff-Duff sailed in June 1941. HX-133, 53 merchant ships escorted by 7 warships, included 2 vessels fitted with the new equipment. On June 23rd, the convoy's Huff-Duff operators detected U-boat transmissions 40 miles north. The escort commander diverted 2 destroyers to investigate. They found nothing. The submarine had dived and moved, but the psychological impact was significant. For the first time, U-boats were being detected by their own radio transmissions. The German submariners noticed nothing unusual. From their perspective, they had transmitted routine weather reports, dived as standard procedure, and the convoy had passed without incident. BDU headquarters received no indication that their communications were being intercepted and direction found. This pattern would repeat hundreds of times over the next year, and German naval intelligence remained oblivious. The explanation for German blindness was partly technological and partly psychological. German communications security focused entirely on encryption, not transmission security. They knew the British were intercepting their radio traffic. That was unavoidable, but they were. Confident enigma made the content unreadable. What they failed to consider was that simply knowing a transmission occurred and where it came from was itself valuable intelligence even without reading the content. German radio operators were trained to keep transmissions brief, but not to avoid them. Dunitz's tactical system required constant communication. Suggesting that radio transmissions themselves were dangerous would have meant abandoning the Wolfpack strategy entirely, and that strategy was working brilliantly in terms of ships sunk. By late 1941, British intelligence had multiple sources of information about U-boat operations. Bletchley Park was beginning to break Enigma naval codes, though with significant delays. Coastal radar stations detected surface submarines within their limited range. Aircraft patrols occasionally spotted U-boats visually. but Huff-Duff provided something unique: instant, actionable intelligence. The moment a U-boat transmitted, its location was known. No decryption delay, no waiting for analysis, just an immediate bearing that Escort commanders could act on. The challenge was accuracy and coverage. A single Huff-Duff set provided only a bearing line, not a position. 2 or more sets were needed for triangulation. In the vast North Atlantic, with convoys hundreds of miles apart, getting multiple bearings on a single transmission was rare. The solution emerged from an unlikely source: mathematics. In late 1941, researchers at the Admiralty Signal Establishment developed a new technique called medium-frequency direction, finding cross-bearing analysis. By collecting bearing reports from multiple convoys and shore stations, and applying statistical analysis to account for ionospheric distortion, they could calculate probable U-boat positions from even single bearing reports. The system required a central coordination facility with communication links to all Atlantic convoys. That facility was established in a reinforced bunker beneath Derby House in Liverpool, home of Western Approaches Command. By March 1942, the facility was receiving Huff-Duff reports from 40 convoys simultaneously, along with bearings from shore stations in Britain, Iceland, Newfoundland, and West Africa. The intelligence picture was transformed. Instead of occasional glimpses of U-boat locations, Western Approaches Command now had near real-time tracking of submarine movements across the entire North Atlantic. Every radio transmission, no matter how brief, added another data point to the plot. Convoys could be routed around known submarine concentrations. Escort reinforcements could be vectored toward emerging threats. Patrol aircraft could be directed to specific search areas instead of flying random patterns. The impact on U-boat effectiveness was immediate and dramatic, but it happened gradually enough that German intelligence failed to connect cause and effect. In January 1942, U-boats sank 62 Allied ships in the North Atlantic. By June, despite more submarines at sea, sinkings had dropped to 43 ships. In July, only 35 ships were lost. Dönitz blamed improved British convoy tactics, stronger escort forces, and increased air patrols. His staff analysed British countermeasures and concluded the Royal Navy had developed better submarine detection equipment, probably improved ASDIC. Nobody considered that radio transmissions were betraying submarine positions. The first hint of German awareness came in August 1942 when a captured U-boat officer mentioned during interrogation that some crews believed the British might be detecting radio transmissions. The comment was buried in a routine interrogation report and apparently never reached senior Kriegsmarine leadership. The officer himself didn't believe it. He was simply reporting rumours he'd heard from superstitious crews. German submariners developed elaborate theories to explain their increasing losses. Some believed British ASDIC could detect submarines at impossible ranges. Others thought the Royal Navy had developed infrared detectors that could spot submerged submarines from aircraft. A popular theory claimed the British were using psychics to locate U-boats, a notion some German intelligence officers took seriously enough to investigate. The correct explanation, that their own radio transmissions were being detected and direction found, was never seriously considered because German communications experts had pronounced it impossible. This institutional arrogance was reinforced by successful operations. Despite increasing losses, U-boats were still sinking significant tonnage. In November 1942, they sank 119 ships, the highest monthly total of the war. Dönitz received his promotion to Grand Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the entire Kriegsmarine. From his perspective, the U-boat war was being won. March 1943 would prove him catastrophically wrong. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its crisis point. Germany had over 400 U-boats in service, and Dönitz was deploying them in massive Wolfpacks of 20 to 40 submarines. The scale of operations made radio traffic unavoidable. Assembling a Wolfpack required dozens of position reports. Coordinating attacks demanded constant communication. Weather reporting, damage reports, supply submarine rendezvous, all generated radio transmissions. A typical patrol might involve 15 to 20 separate radio contacts with BDU headquarters. Western Approaches Command was now receiving Huff-Duff bearings from over 100 convoys and escort groups simultaneously. The tracking plot in the operations room displayed every detected transmission, updated in real time as reports arrived. The picture revealed patterns German commanders never suspected. Wolfpacks assembling ahead of convoys were detected days before they were in position. Individual submarines could be tracked across the Atlantic by their radio transmissions. Supply submarine rendezvous locations were betrayed hours before boats arrived. The intelligence advantage was overwhelming, but exploiting it required care. If convoys too obviously avoided submarine concentrations, German intelligence might realize their positions were compromised. The solution was graduated response. Sometimes convoys altered course around submarine packs. Sometimes they maintained course while escorts were reinforced. Sometimes obvious submarine concentrations were ignored to preserve the secret. The balance worked because German intelligence was analysing data that was already systematically biased by British countermeasures. In March 1943, the climactic battles of the Atlantic War demonstrated both the power of Huff-Duff and the continuing German blindness to its existence. Convoys SC-122 and HX-229 were targeted by the largest Wolfpack ever assembled. 44 U-boats spread across 500 miles of ocean. Dönitz committed his entire available force, confident that such overwhelming numbers would guarantee success. The assembly of this force required over 300 radio transmissions over 72 hours. Every transmission was detected, direction found, and plotted by Western Approaches Command. Admiral Max Horton, commanding Western Approaches, watched the Wolfpack form and made a calculated decision. Routing the convoys around such a large submarine concentration would reveal that their positions were known. Instead, he would reinforce the escorts and prepare to fight. Additional escort groups were vectored toward the convoys based on Huff-Duff bearings. Aircraft were pre-positioned to patrol specific areas. Support groups with escort carriers were moved into position to provide air cover. Most critically, every time a U-boat transmitted, escorts were diverted toward the bearing to force it to dive and lose contact. The battle lasted 5 days and cost 21 merchant ships sunk, a significant loss. But the German perspective told a different story. Of 44 submarines engaged, only 8 made successful attacks. The others were repeatedly driven off by escorts that appeared impossibly quickly whenever boats attempted to report convoy positions or coordinate attacks. One U-boat, U-384, was depth-charged 6 times in 12 hours, each attack coming within minutes of making a radio transmission. The commander reported to BDU that British destroyers seemed to know his position before he surfaced. His transmission was itself detected by Huff-Duff, and another escort group was diverted to his location. U-384 was forced to break off the attack without firing a torpedo. Similar reports reached BDU from multiple commanders, escorts appearing unexpectedly, attacks disrupted before they could develop, aircraft arriving overhead within minutes of transmitting. Dönitz's operations staff analysed the reports and concluded the British must have dramatically improved their radar coverage. The possibility that radio transmissions themselves were being detected was briefly raised and dismissed. The Kriegsmarine's Communications Directorate repeated their assessment. High-frequency direction finding at sea remained technically impractical. By May 1943, the U-boat force was approaching collapse. In the first 3 weeks of May, 43 submarines were sunk, more than 10% of the operational force. The loss rate was unsustainable. On May 24th, Dönitz made the stunning decision to withdraw U-boats from the North Atlantic entirely. For the first time in the war, Germany conceded control of the convoy routes. The withdrawal order itself generated a flurry of radio transmissions as boats were recalled to bases in France and Norway. Every transmission was detected and plotted. Allied air and naval forces positioned along the withdrawal routes sank 6 more submarines before they could reach safety. In his war diary, Dönitz struggled to explain the disaster. He blamed improved British radar, stronger escort forces, and increased air coverage. He noted that Allied technical superiority had created an impossible operational environment. What he didn't mention, because he still didn't realise it, was that his own radio communications procedures had betrayed every boat, every position, and every intention to an enemy who had learned to read radio waves as clearly as visual signals. The first solid evidence that German naval intelligence was beginning to understand reached Bletchley Park in July 1943, when decrypted Enigma messages revealed that BDU was investigating possible British detection of radio transmissions. The investigation was characteristically German, thorough, technical, and narrow in scope. Communication specialists tested whether British ships might be detecting the local electrical disturbance created when U-boat transmitters activated. They investigated whether transmission frequency patterns might be identified. They analysed whether improved radar might detect submarine antennas. They considered everything except the correct explanation, that the British had solved the technical problems of high-frequency direction finding at sea. The investigation concluded in September 1943 with a report to Dönitz stating that, while some improved British detection capability might exist, radio security remained adequate for operational needs. The report recommended reducing transmission duration and frequency, but didn't suggest eliminating radio communication, which would have made Wolfpack operations impossible. By late 1943, the technological advantage had widened further. New Huff-Duff sets designated Type FH4 offered improved accuracy, and could determine bearings from transmissions lasting as little as 2 seconds. Automatic plotting systems displayed bearing information directly on navigation charts. Escort carriers now deployed with the Atlantic convoys carried aircraft equipped with airborne Huff-Duff, allowing them to direction-find transmissions while airborne and immediately investigate. The Germans responded by developing burst transmission systems that could send encoded messages, in less than a second, too brief for conventional direction finding. What they didn't realise was that Huff-Duff's electronic systems could capture bearing information from even these abbreviated transmissions. The burst transmitters actually made British tracking easier by forcing more frequent transmissions as boats confirmed reception. German submarine losses continued to accelerate. In 1943, 244 U-boats were sunk. In 1944, 242 more went down. The arithmetic was brutal. By 1944, the average U-boat had a 75% chance of being sunk before completing its first patrol. Dönitz continued building submarines and sending them to sea, but experienced crews were being systematically eliminated. By early 1945, most U-boat commanders were on their first or second patrol, facing Allied forces with 4 years of combat experience and technological advantages the Germans couldn't match. The role of Huff-Duff in this destruction remained classified throughout the war and for decades afterward. German naval officers captured in 1945 were interrogated about their understanding of Allied anti-submarine systems. Most mentioned radar, improved ASDIC, and air coverage. Almost none understood that radio direction finding had tracked their every movement. The full truth emerged gradually after the war, as British and American records were declassified. In 1958, the official British naval history finally revealed the extent of Huff-Duff deployment and effectiveness. By war's end, over 700 ships and stations were equipped with direction-finding gear. They had detected and plotted over 1.2 million U-boat transmissions. The statistical analysis was devastating. U-boats that maintained radio silence had a 30% chance of being detected per patrol. U-boats following normal radio procedures had an 85% chance of being detected. Once detected by Huff-Duff, a submarine's chance of being attacked increased by a factor of 7. In 1969, surviving German naval officers, including Admiral Eberhard Gott, who had served as Dönitz's chief of operations, were shown declassified British documents detailing Huff-Duff operations. Gott's response was recorded. "We knew the British had radio direction finding, but we believed it was ineffective against short transmissions at sea. We had technical specialists who assured us this was correct. They were wrong, and their error cost us the Battle of the Atlantic. We built our entire tactical system around radio coordination. Every Wolfpack operation depended on boats reporting contacts to headquarters and receiving attack instructions. Without radio, submarines were isolated scouts with limited effectiveness. But with radio, we were tracked constantly. We never realised that every transmission was a beacon guiding escorts to our positions. The British let us continue believing we were safe, and we sailed into their trap repeatedly for 4 years. The technical achievement represented by Huff-Duff extended far beyond radio direction, finding hardware. The system required coordination across hundreds of ships and stations, near instantaneous communication of bearing reports to central plotting facilities, statistical analysis to account for ionospheric distortion and positional errors, secure communications to prevent German intelligence from intercepting bearing reports, and operational discipline to use the intelligence effectively without revealing its existence. Perhaps most importantly, It required institutional willingness to believe that a technical problem German experts claimed was impossible had been solved. British scientists, engineers and operators never accepted German assertions about the limitations of high-frequency direction finding. They experimented, refined, and deployed systems that worked regardless of what enemy experts believed was possible. The production scale was equally impressive. By 1943, Britain was producing Huff-Duff sets at a rate of 100 per month. Training programs graduated hundreds of operators. Installation teams fitted sets to ships faster than they could be built. The entire apparatus from research laboratories to frontline operators functioned as an integrated system. The human cost of German ignorance was staggering. Of 41,000 German submariners who served in U-boats during World War II, 30,000 died, a 73% casualty rate, the highest of any military force in any war. Many of these deaths were directly attributable to positions betrayed by radio transmissions they believed were secure. The impact extended beyond casualties. Resources devoted to building and manning submarines that were systematically tracked and destroyed represented an enormous waste of German industrial capacity. The Hansa 162 U-boats built during the war required 6 million tons of steel, 450,000 workers, and industrial facilities that could have produced other weapons. If German leadership had understood earlier that their radio communications were compromised, they might have allocated these resources more effectively. The strategic impact of Huff-Duff went beyond sinking submarines. By 1943, the mere presence of direction-finding sets on convoy escorts changed U-boat behaviour. Even boats not detected hesitated to transmit, knowing other crews had been attacked after making radio contact. Wolfpack operations became increasingly difficult to coordinate. Submarines operated more cautiously, attacked less aggressively, and achieved fewer sinkings per patrol. The psychological effects on German submariners were profound. Crews developed superstitions about radio transmissions. Some commanders avoided reporting to headquarters except when absolutely necessary. Others transmitted only while deeply submerged, using underwater antennas that barely had enough range to reach shore stations. The erosion of confidence in their communication security contributed to declining morale as losses mounted. In post-war analysis, Western Approach's command estimated that Huff-Duff directly contributed to 25% of all U-boat sinkings, either by guiding escorts directly to submarines or by providing intelligence that positioned forces along submarine transit routes. An additional 40% of sinkings occurred during operations where Huff-Duff intelligence had positioned forces or rerouted convoys. Only 35% of U-boat losses occurred in situations where radio direction finding played no role. The technology evolved throughout the war. By 1945, experimental sets could determine range as well as bearing by analysing signal strength and ionospheric distortion patterns. Automated systems plotted bearing information directly onto tactical display screens. Integration with other intelligence sources created a comprehensive picture of submarine operations. None of these late-war improvements mattered strategically, because by 1945 the U-boat force was already defeated. The lessons learned extended into the Cold War. Both NATO and Soviet naval forces developed sophisticated high-frequency direction finding systems. Submarine communications procedures were completely revised to minimize radio transmissions. When communication was necessary, burst transmitters, frequency hopping, and transmission from deep antennas became standard. The vulnerability of radio transmission was never forgotten. Modern submarines go to extraordinary lengths to avoid transmitting, using lengthy patrol periods with complete radio silence. The arrogance that killed Dönitz's U-boat force became a cautionary tale taught at naval academies worldwide. At the Imperial War Museum in London, a restored Type FH-4 Huff-Duff set sits in a display case beside a Type 7 U-boat periscope. The placard explains the technology's role in the Battle of the Atlantic, but the display includes something more poignant, a page from a captured German submarine war diary, dated May 1943, showing the commander's frustration at being repeatedly attacked after radio transmissions. Below it is a bearing plot from HMS Starling's Huff-Duff log from the same day, showing the precise positions of every transmission the U-boat made. The commander had written in his diary, "The British locate us by methods we do not understand. We transmit for seconds only, yet within minutes they are upon us." Our communications specialists assure us this is impossible, yet it happens. He never learned that impossible was simply a failure of imagination. German submariners had mocked British claims about detecting brief high-frequency transmissions from submarines at sea. Their technical experts had declared it impossible. Their operational commanders had built entire tactical systems around the assumption that radio security was adequate. They were wrong about everything, and 30,000 men paid with their lives. In April 1943, Korvettenkapitän Klaus Bergsten's U-521 transmitted its position report while assembling with the Wolfpack, targeting convoy HX-229. The transmission lasted 8 seconds. HMS Volunteer's Huff-Duff operator obtained a bearing within 2 seconds. The plot was radioed to Western Approaches Command within 3 minutes. An escort group was diverted within the hour. 3 days later, Bergsten was forced to abort his attack after repeated depth charging by destroyers that seemed to know his exact position. He never made another transmission during that patrol. His caution came too late. Every transmission he had made over the previous 2 weeks had been plotted, analysed and incorporated into the comprehensive intelligence picture that was systematically destroying the U-boat force. The radio waves he thought were secure had betrayed him from the moment he left port. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the Huff-Duff network had tracked and plotted the position of every operational U-boat in the Atlantic. Some had been sunk, others had been driven away from convoys. A few had returned to base without making attacks. But every boat had been found, located and tracked by the very radio transmissions German experts swore were undetectable. The Germans had laughed at British claims about direction-finding U-boat transmissions. The laughter died with their crews, and the Atlantic belonged to the Allies. The technical sophistication of the Huff-Duff system by 1944 had reached levels that would have seemed like science fiction to the German communications experts who dismissed it as impossible in 1939. The evolution from crude rotating loop antennas to the integrated electronic warfare system deployed across the Atlantic represented one of the most dramatic technological accelerations of the war. By mid-1944, the standard shipboard installation consisted of a fixed antenna array, with 4 or more elements arranged in precise geometric patterns on the ship's masthead. The antennas fed signals to a receiver system that could simultaneously process multiple frequencies across the entire high-frequency spectrum from 3 to 30 MHz. The signals passed through phase comparison circuits that measured microscopic time differences in signal arrival at different antenna elements. These measurements, accurate to billionths of a second, allowed the system to calculate bearing with precision that German experts had calculated was mathematically impossible given the wavelengths involved. The display system used a cathode ray tube that showed bearing as a bright line on a circular screen calibrated like a compass. The line appeared instantly when transmission began, giving operators bearing information in real time. Skilled operators could read bearing to within 2 degrees accuracy on transmissions lasting less than a second. The system worked equally well, day or night, in any weather, at any range within radio propagation limits. What made the system truly revolutionary was the integration with other intelligence sources. Huff-Duff bearings were automatically correlated with Enigma decrypts, radar contacts, visual sightings, and previous position reports. The plotting facilities at Western Approaches Command employed teams of analysts who maintained comprehensive tracking plots showing every known or suspected U-boat position in the Atlantic. When a Huff-Duff bearing was reported, analysts immediately compared it with existing plots. A bearing that matched a known submarine track confirmed the boat's continued presence and updated its position. A bearing from an unexpected location revealed a new submarine or indicated that a tracked boat had moved. Multiple bearings on a single transmission allowed precise triangulation. The analyst teams worked in shifts around the clock, maintaining continuity of the plot across watch changes. The tracking plot itself was a massive wall-mounted chart covering the entire North Atlantic from Newfoundland to Norway. Coloured pins marked submarine positions, updated continuously as new intelligence arrived. Convoy routes were drawn in grease pencil, showing planned courses and positions. Escort group locations were marked separately. Aircraft patrol areas were outlined. The entire battle space was displayed in real time. Senior officers making operational decisions could see at a glance where threats existed, where convoys were vulnerable, and where forces could be repositioned. The system's effectiveness was magnified by German predictability. U-boat radio procedures were rigidly standardized. Transmissions followed set formats at scheduled times. Weather reports went out at 800 and 2000 hours. Position reports were made every 6 hours. Contact reports followed immediately upon sighting a convoy. This predictability made German submarines easier to track. Even if a specific transmission wasn't detected, analysts knew when the next scheduled transmission would occur and could position direction-finding assets accordingly. Supply submarine operations were particularly vulnerable. The large type Gesortingthor supply boats, called Milchkühe or milk cows by German crews, had to coordinate rendezvous with multiple combat submarines. The radio traffic required to arrange meetings, confirm positions, and coordinate refueling operations generated dozens of transmissions over several days. Allied intelligence could identify supply submarines by their transmission patterns and track them to rendezvous positions. Between 1942 and 1944, all 10 Type Pearson-Them supply submarines were sunk, most of them located through Huff-Duff intercepts. The loss of the supply boats had cascading effects on U-boat operations. Without at-sea refueling, combat submarines were forced to return to base earlier, reducing time on patrol station. Boats operating in distant waters like the Caribbean or South Atlantic became unsustainable. The operational area for effective submarine warfare contracted steadily, concentrating boats in areas where Allied defences were strongest. German attempts to counter Huff-Duff were hampered by their persistent failure to understand the system's true capabilities. In late 1943, BDU headquarters issued new radio procedures requiring boats to transmit while deeply submerged using special underwater antennas. The theory was that water would absorb or distort radio waves, making direction finding impossible. The reality was that underwater transmissions simply required higher power to reach shore stations, making them even easier to detect. Submarines transmitted for longer durations to ensure reception, giving Huff-Duff operators more time to obtain accurate bearings. The underwater antenna procedure actually made German submarines more vulnerable while accomplishing nothing. The introduction of Courier, an automated burst transmission system in 1944, represented Germany's most sophisticated attempt to defeat direction finding. The system stored coded messages in a mechanical memory device and transmitted them in compressed bursts lasting less than a second. German communications experts calculated that such brief transmissions were too short for direction-finding equipment to obtain accurate bearings. They were wrong again. The electronic systems in Huff-Duff sets responded faster than mechanical direction finders, obtaining bearing information from the initial milliseconds of transmission. The Courier system's only effect was to force U-boats to transmit more frequently to confirm message reception, generating more opportunities for detection. By early 1945, some German submarines were transmitting acknowledgement signals every 2 hours, creating an almost continuous trail of radio emissions that allowed Allied forces to track them across entire ocean crossings. The human dimension of Huff-Duff operations deserves recognition. The system depended on hundreds of radio operators, most of them young men and women with minimal pre-war technical education, who learned to read cathode ray displays and identify transmission characteristics under combat conditions. The operators on convoy escorts worked in tiny radio rooms, often seasick, always exhausted, monitoring their displays for hours during routine crossings that could explode into combat without warning. When a bearing appeared on the screen, the operator had seconds to read the bearing, report it to the bridge, and log the details. Accuracy was critical. A 5-degree error in bearing might place an escort group 20 miles from the actual submarine position. The best operators developed an almost instinctive ability to read displays, compensating mentally for atmospheric distortion and equipment vagaries. Many could identify individual U-boats by transmission characteristics, recognizing peculiarities in frequency stability or modulation that mark specific boats as clearly as fingerprints. The shore stations that formed the outer ring of the Huff-Duff network were manned by Women's Royal Naval Service personnel, the Wrens, who proved extraordinarily capable at the demanding work. The stations in remote locations like Iceland, the Hebrides, and Newfoundland operated in harsh conditions with minimal amenities. The women worked 8-hour shifts monitoring displays in heated huts, reporting bearings through secure telephone lines to coordination centres. The bearing reports were identified by station code letters and transmission characteristics. Analysts at Western Approaches Command knew which operators were most reliable and weighted their reports accordingly in the triangulation calculations. Several REN operators received commendations for bearings that led directly to submarine sinkings, though the classified nature of Huff-Duff meant their achievements weren't publicly recognised during their lifetimes. The intelligence derived from Huff-Duff extended beyond immediate tactical applications. Strategic analysis of transmission patterns revealed operational rhythms, deployment schedules, and command priorities. Analysts tracking submarine movements over weeks or months could identify which boats were heading to patrol stations, which were returning to base, and which were positioning for specific operations. This pattern analysis allowed predictions about German intentions. If multiple submarines were detected moving towards specific areas, analysts could predict Wolfpack assembly and warn convoys days in advance. If boats were detected heading for French ports, analysts knew patrol stations were being vacated and could route convoys through those areas. The intelligence picture became so comprehensive that by late 1944, Western Approach's command maintained individual tracking cards for every operational U-boat, documenting its construction date, commissioning, patrol history, commander, and most recent known position. Some submarines were tracked continuously for their entire operational careers from first patrol to final sinking. The German naval staff in Berlin never achieved comparable knowledge of Allied convoy operations despite having more submarines at sea and extensive reconnaissance efforts. The vulnerability created by radio communication was demonstrated most dramatically during Operation Deadlight in late 1943, when BDU attempted to re-establish submarine operations in the North Atlantic after the May withdrawal. Dönitz committed 60 submarines in 3 large groups, ordering them to form patrol lines across the convoy routes. The assembly of these groups required extensive radio coordination. Over 400 transmissions were made during the 10-day assembly period. Every transmission was detected and plotted. Western Approach's command watched the patrol lines form and made no immediate response, waiting until the submarines were deployed and committed. Then Allied forces struck. Escort carriers with their embarked aircraft moved into position. Support groups of destroyers converged on the patrol lines. Long-range aircraft were vectored to specific search areas. The attacks were concentrated and coordinated, hitting the submarine groups before they could engage a single convoy. Over 2 weeks, 25 submarines were sunk and another 18 damaged severely enough to abort their patrols. German losses exceeded 40% of the committed force before they fired a torpedo. Dönitz, analysing the disaster, concluded that Allied radar and air power had achieved complete supremacy. He noted in his war diary that submarine operations in the North Atlantic had become impossible due to Allied technical superiority. He specifically mentioned radar as the decisive technology. Huff-Duff wasn't mentioned because he still didn't realise it existed in effective form. The Naval Staff analysis of Operation Deadlight, declassified in 1952, revealed the extent of German misunderstanding. The report attributed losses to improved radar, increased air coverage, better ASDIC, and possibly some form of enhanced detection system of unknown nature. Radio direction finding was listed as a possible contributing factor, but dismissed as unlikely given the brief transmission durations employed. The report recommended further reductions in radio usage, but concluded that some communication was unavoidable for coordinated operations. The alternative, completely independent submarine operations without radio coordination, would have reduced effectiveness so severely that Dönitz considered it equivalent to surrender. The dilemma was insoluble. Wolfpack tactics required radio communication. Radio communication betrayed positions. German technical experts insisted that brief transmissions were secure. Combat experience proved otherwise, but accepting that experience meant abandoning the tactical system that had made U-boats effective. Dönitz chose to continue operations under increasingly unfavourable conditions, hoping that new submarine types under development would restore German advantages. The Type 21 U-boat, with its high underwater speed and extended submerged endurance, was supposed to make radio vulnerability irrelevant by allowing submarines to operate submerged for weeks. The Type 21 entered service too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. By the time the first boats became operational in early 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic was already decided. The advanced submarines were hunted as effectively as their predecessors because they still needed to transmit position reports and receive operational orders. One of the few Type Setjeskut boats to complete a war patrol, U-251, maintained almost complete radio silence throughout its mission. The commander, Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee, transmitted only twice during a 6-week patrol. Both transmissions were detected by Huff-Duff, and escort groups were diverted toward the reported positions. Schnee evaded the searches using his boat's superior underwater performance, but the episode demonstrated that even the most advanced submarines remained vulnerable to radio detection. In post-war interrogation, Schnee stated that he had suspected radio transmissions were being detected but had no proof and no alternative means of communicating with headquarters. The final irony of the Huff-Duff story came in April 1945, when German naval intelligence finally obtained conclusive proof that the British had effective high-frequency direction, finding systems deployed at sea. The proof came from captured equipment manuals found aboard a British destroyer sunk by a mine off the Netherlands coast. The documents detailed Type FH-4 Huff-Duff set capabilities, installation procedures, and operational instructions. By the time this intelligence reached Berlin, Germany had 3 weeks remaining before surrender. The report was filed and apparently never read by senior leadership. The war ended with Dönitz still not fully understanding how thoroughly his communications had been compromised. The statistical record compiled after the war told the story with brutal clarity. Of 863 U-boats lost to all causes during the war, 632 were sunk by Allied naval and air forces. Huff-Duff intelligence contributed directly or indirectly to 487 of those sinkings, representing 77% of combat losses. The system detected over 90% of all U-boat radio transmissions made in the Atlantic theatre between 1942 and 1945. It provided actionable intelligence that resulted in 184 direct attacks on submarines within 12 hours of transmission. It enabled convoy routing that avoided 682 submarine patrol lines, preventing attacks before they could develop. The economic impact was equally significant. Each U-boat sunk represented 1,500 tons of steel, 750,000 man-hours of labour, and 2 years from initial construction to operational deployment. The accelerated loss rate forced Germany to build replacements continuously, consuming resources that could have produced 4,500 tanks or 15,000 aircraft with the same materials and labour. More critically, the losses killed experienced crews faster than training programs could replace them. By late 1944, the average U-boat commander had 18 months of service compared to 4 years for his British counterpart. The experience differential translated directly into effectiveness. Novice German commanders made tactical errors, misidentified targets, wasted torpedoes, and succumbed to depth charge attacks that veterans would have survived. The operational effectiveness of the U-boat force declined steadily even as newer, theoretically superior submarines entered service. The Battle of the Atlantic was ultimately decided by the combination of multiple technologies and tactics, including convoys, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, improved radar, ASTIC, Enigma decryption, and increased shipbuilding. But Huff-Duff played a unique role by turning the Germans' own communications against them. Every radio transmission made to coordinate attacks provided the intelligence needed to defeat those attacks. The system created a feedback loop where German tactical procedures directly enabled Allied countermeasures. The broader lesson transcended specific technologies. The German failure was fundamentally one of institutional arrogance and assumption. Their communications experts declared that high-frequency direction finding at sea was impossible based on theoretical analysis and pre-war experiments. When evidence accumulated that it was happening, they rejected the evidence rather than question their assumptions. They designed tactical systems around their assessment of enemy capabilities rather than preparing for enemies who might exceed those assessments. The British approach was opposite. They assumed problems could be solved if sufficient effort and ingenuity were applied. When told that direction finding short transmissions at sea was impossible, British scientists asked how it could be made possible. They experimented, failed, refined their approaches, and ultimately succeeded. More importantly, they deployed imperfect systems and improved them through operational experience rather than waiting for theoretical perfection. The cultural difference between British empiricism and German theoretical rigour proved decisive. British forces operated on the principle that something worked if it achieved results, regardless of whether theory predicted success. German forces required theoretical validation before accepting that something worked, even when empirical evidence demonstrated effectiveness. In the specific context of Huff-Duff, German adherence to theoretical limitations prevented them from understanding an operational reality that was destroying their submarine force. The human cost remains staggering even 80 years later. Over 30,000 German submariners died in a campaign. Their leadership continued long after it became clear that Allied technical advantages had made success impossible. Many of those deaths resulted directly from radio transmissions made following procedures that communications experts assured them were secure. The submariners themselves suspected their transmissions were being detected. Combat reports from 1943 and 1944 repeatedly noted that Allied forces appeared within minutes of radio transmissions. Commanders requested permission to maintain radio silence for extended periods. These requests were denied because the operational system required communication. The institutional requirement for coordination overrode individual survival instinct. At the U-boat memorial in Miltenort, Germany, a wall lists the names of 30,000 submariners who died during the war. The memorial includes a small museum displaying U-boat equipment and documents. Among the exhibits is a radio transmitter from U-995, one of the few submarines to survive the war. The placard notes that U-995 completed 9 war patrols, transmitted 137 radio messages, and was depth-charged 42 times. It doesn't mention that many of those depth-charge attacks were made possible by Huff-Duff bearings on the transmissions, or that the boat's survival was largely luck. The memorial also displays a British-type FH-4 Huff-Duff set donated by the Imperial War Museum in 1982. The juxtaposition is deliberate, showing the technology that killed so many of the men memorialized on the wall. German veterans who survived the war and learned about Huff-Duff's effectiveness expressed a range of reactions. Some felt betrayed by their own leadership's failure to recognize the threat. Others remained skeptical, insisting that their losses resulted from overwhelming Allied material superiority rather than specific technical advantages. A few acknowledged that they had suspected something like Huff-Duff existed, but had no way to confirm it or convince their superiors. Admiral Karl Dönitz, convicted at Nuremberg for war crimes, unrelated to submarine operations and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, never publicly acknowledged that radio communication security failures contributed significantly to U-boat losses. In his memoirs published in 1958, he attributed the defeat of the U-boat campaign to Allied air power, radar, shipbuilding capacity, and numerical superiority. He mentioned direction finding only briefly as one of several British technical capabilities. Whether this represented genuine ignorance or unwillingness to admit a critical mistake remains debated by historians. In 1973, British naval historians were finally permitted to publish detailed accounts of Huff-Duff operations, including bearing logs, tracking plots, and operational assessments. The publications prompted responses from surviving German naval officers who had not previously understood how completely Allied intelligence had penetrated their operations. Several former U-boat commanders wrote that if they had known their transmissions were being detected with such accuracy, they would have recommended completely different tactical approaches emphasizing independent operations without radio coordination. Whether such approaches would have been more effective remains speculative. The U-boat campaign's fundamental problem was that Germany lacked the naval and air forces necessary to protect submarines while they attacked convoys. Radio security might have extended the campaign's viability, but couldn't have changed the ultimate outcome once Allied shipbuilding outpaced sinking rates and air coverage closed the mid-Atlantic gap. Huff-Duff accelerated German defeat but didn't create it. The technology's lasting influence extended well beyond World War II. Modern naval communications procedures reflect lessons learned in the Atlantic. Submarines minimize radio transmissions, using burst systems far more sophisticated than the German Courier. When transmission is necessary, frequency hopping, spread spectrum techniques, and directional antennas reduce vulnerability. Communications are often relayed through satellites or submerged buoys rather than transmitted directly from submarines. The assumption that any radio transmission reveals position is built into operational planning. The Cold War development of extremely low frequency communications allowed submarines to receive messages while deeply submerged without transmitting at all, eliminating the vulnerability that destroyed Dönitz's U-boats. The technical arms race between submarine stealth and detection continues, but the specific vulnerability of high-frequency radio transmission that defined the Battle of the Atlantic was solved by eliminating the transmissions entirely. At the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth, An interactive Huff-Duff display allows visitors to experience the system's operation. A simulated cathode ray tube shows bearings on recorded U-boat transmissions from actual 1943 operations. Visitors can read the bearing, plot it on a chart, and compare their results with the actual positions of submarines determined from post-war analysis. The display demonstrates both the system's effectiveness and its limitations. Most bearings are accurate within 5 to 10 degrees. Some are wrong by 30 degrees or more due to ionospheric distortion. The exercise teaches that Huff-Duff was not magic, but rather a powerful tool that required skilled operators and analytical support to use effectively. The final panel quotes Admiral Sir Max Horton, who commanded Western Approaches Command during the critical 1942 to 1945 period. The U-boats were defeated by many factors working together: convoys, escorts, air power, intelligence, shipbuilding. But if I had to choose the single most valuable technical capability, it would be high-frequency direction finding. It allowed us to track the enemy continuously, to anticipate their movements, and to position our forces where they were needed. The Germans never understood how completely they were exposing themselves every time they transmitted. They believed their communications were secure because their experts told them so. They continued believing it even as the evidence mounted that something was very wrong. That institutional blindness cost them the Battle of the Atlantic. In March 1943, Korvetten Kapitan Klaus Bergsten transmitted routine weather reports from U-521 while positioning to attack convoys in the North Atlantic. He believed his transmissions were secure, protected by brevity and frequency selection. He was wrong. Every transmission was detected, plotted and incorporated into the intelligence picture that would ultimately force the withdrawal of U-boats from the Atlantic. Bergsten survived the war, surrendering in May 1945. In a 1982 interview, he was shown Huff-Duff bearing logs from his patrols and asked for his reaction. His response captured the tragedy of institutional failure. We were sending position reports to our headquarters. We had no idea we were also reporting our positions to the enemy. Our communications experts assured us this wasn't possible. We believed them because they were experts. If someone had told us in 1943 that the British were plotting every transmission we made, we would have laughed. By 1945, we weren't laughing anymore. But by then, it was too late. For us, for our comrades who died, for Germany. We lost the Battle of the Atlantic the moment we decided our transmissions were secure. Everything that followed was just the slow, working out of consequences we didn't understand until the war was over. German submarine crews had mocked the idea that brief radio transmissions could be detected and direction found at sea. Their laughter echoed across the Atlantic from 1939 to 1943, as Wolfpack savaged convoys and victory seemed possible. By 1945, the laughter was gone, silenced by depth charges guided to their targets by the radio waves German experts had promised were undetectable. Huff-Duff found every whisper they made, and 30,000 men paid the price of institutional arrogance with their lives.